Have you ever had someone say something gently, so gently, that it takes a moment to realize they're pushing you away? That's how it happened for me. My wife Helen sat across from me at the kitchen table one gray December afternoon and said, "Frank, maybe it would be better if you didn't come up to the lodge this year." The words landed softly. Too softly. I'm Frank Miller. I'm 68 years old. Helen and I have been married for 41 years. We met in our early 20s, struggled through lean years, raised 2 children, buried parents, survived illnesses, and built what I believed was a permanent kind of partnership. So when she said that sentence calm, rehearsed, careful, my first reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion. "Didn't come?" I asked. "You mean not at all?" Helen nodded, her eyes fixed on her tea. "Just this once. Things have been tense lately." Tense. That word felt practiced. "The kids think it might be easier," she added. "You've been sharp." "Sharp," she explained then. A comment I made to our son Daniel about leaving his job to chase a business idea. Something I said. At our daughter Claire's dinner, an opinion about her boyfriend's lifestyle that I hadn't realized had landed so badly. "They feel judged," Helen said quietly, "like they can't relax around you." I leaned back, staring at the familiar scratch on the table where Daniel once carved his initials as a boy. "I was talking," I said. "I wasn't attacking anyone." "That's the problem," she replied. "You don't hear the difference anymore." That sentence stayed with me. "So this is the solution?" I asked. "Christmas without me?" "No. It's not a punishment," she said quickly. "Just a pause." A pause. She reached for my hand, then stopped halfway, as if unsure whether the gesture still belonged to her. "Maybe you could visit your cousin in Calgary," she offered. I hadn't seen my cousin in years. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle around me. The same house I'd repaired, painted, maintained. Helen slept beside me, turned toward the window. I thought about all the winters we'd spent at the lodge, the snowstorms, the card games, the laughter that once came easily. When did my presence become something to manage? The next morning, Helen left early for errands. She left a note on the counter. "Didn't want to wake you. I'll be back later." I spent the day in the garage where I'd been spending more time lately. Not hiding, retreating. It was the only place where I didn't feel the need to soften my words or shrink my thoughts. To them, it probably looked like I was just an old man killing time. But I wasn't. For months, I'd been working quietly on something. Something none of them asked about. Something they never noticed. And standing there among tools and papers, something became painfully clear. I wasn't being left behind because I was difficult. I was being left behind because they had already decided who I was. And once people stop seeing you as someone who can still grow, they stop listening altogether. What they didn't know was this. While they were learning how to live without me, I was about to rediscover who I was without them. The days after that conversation with Helen moved strangely, not loudly, not dramatically, just quieter than before. She packed for the lodge as if everything were normal sweaters folded carefully. Groceries listed on the fridge, plans discussed with the kids over speakerphone while I stood in the next room. Pretending not to hear, no one argued. No one apologized. That hurt more than anger ever could. And that's when I understood something uncomfortable. This hadn't started with Christmas. Christmas was just the moment they finally said it out loud. For a while now, my opinions had been met with polite smiles instead of conversation. When I spoke at dinner, someone would gently change the subject. When I offered advice, it landed like background noise, present, but unimportant. I hadn't become cruel. I hadn't become careless. I'd become inconvenient. Even the house reflected it. Over the years, Helen had reorganized everything. New furniture, new routines, new rules about what stayed where. Slowly, without discussion, the spaces that felt like mine disappeared, all except one, the garage. That space remained untouched by quiet negotiations. My tools still hung where I'd placed them. The radio stayed on the station I liked. The workbench still carried the marks of projects finished and abandoned. I spent hours there, not hiding, not sulking, thinking, from the outside, it probably looked like retreat. Like an old man with nowhere else to go. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I was thinking harder than I had in years. A few months earlier, I'd run into an old colleague from my engineering days, Mark Ellison, at a retirement luncheon. We shared a table, exchanged polite updates, complained about how quickly everything had gone digital at one point. Mark leaned in and said something casually, almost as an aside. "Most projects don't fail because of bad ideas," he said. "They fail because people stop coordinating. Too many systems, too many gaps." The comment stayed with me. I'd spent decades watching projects stall not from incompetence, but from disconnect. The same mistakes, repeating under new names. That night, instead of watching television, I went into the garage and pulled out old notebooks, sketches, frameworks, methods I'd once used to solve complicated problems with far fewer tools. I didn't tell Helen. I didn't tell thee. Kids, not because I was hiding, but because no one had asked what I was working on in years, so I taught myself quietly. Read late into the night. Tested ideas on outdated data. Adjusted, refined, simplified down there. I didn't feel old. I felt focused. Upstairs, life went on without me. Plans were made. Decisions were shared after the fact. My role had shifted from participant to observer, and that's when the realization arrived, sharp and unwelcome. I wasn't being excluded. Because I was wrong, I was being excluded. Because I reminded them of a version of themselves they no longer wanted to confront. Experience can be uncomfortable. It asks questions. It remembers consequences, and sometimes it's easier to silence it than to listen. As the days passed and Christmas crept closer, Helen spoke less about the lodge. The kids stopped calling. Silence settled in thick, unquestioned. But beneath that silence, something else was forming. Because while they were adjusting to a quieter version of me, I was building something that would make it impossible to overlook me again. And when someone finally looked at what I'd been working on, everything would change. Have you ever carried an idea for so long that it starts to feel like a secret, not because you're hiding it, but because no one would believe it came from you? That's how it felt working in the garage late at night. Long after Helen went to bed and the house settled into silence, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to surprise anyone. I was trying to solve a problem I'd seen my entire working life. Back when I was still an engineer, long before retirement, dinners and polite speeches projects failed for the same reasons again and again. Not because people were careless or incapable, because no one was speaking the same language. Architects, contractors, inspectors, suppliers, different systems, different assumptions, different timelines, and somehow the cost always landed in the same place. Delay, waste, blame. Years ago, I'd built a simple framework to address that. Nothing flashy, just a way to align information so fewer things slipped through the cracks. It worked quietly, efficiently until newer software arrived and buried it under layers of complexity. But the idea never left me. After that conversation with Mark Ellison, it resurfaced not as nostalgia, but as possibility. What if the old logic could be rebuilt using modern tools? What if coordination didn't require more meetings? Just clearer translation? So I started learning again, not casually, not half-heartedly. I watched tutorials late into the night, pausing and replaying until the concept settled. I read documentation the way I once read blueprints, slowly, deliberately, searching for structure beneath the surface. I made mistakes, plenty of them. Sometimes the screen went dark, and I had no idea why. I didn't tell anyone, because to them, I was just an older man keeping busy. Joked once about me playing with software. Claire teased me about becoming a late-life tech wizard. They meant it kindly, but they never asked what I was actually building, and that was fine, because down there among wires, notes, and half-finished diagrams I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Momentum by early December. I had something that worked, not polished, not impressive to look at, but it did exactly what I needed it to do. It translated. It caught errors before they multiplied. It reduced overlap, confusion, and wasted effort. I tested it again and again using old project data I still had archived. Each time, the results were the same. Cleaner timelines, fewer conflicts, clear accountability. One night, I stared at the screen longer than usual, my heart beating faster than it had in months. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't therapy. This was real. I thought about telling Helen. I imagined the polite smile, the careful nod. Duh, that's nice. Frank tone she'd developed lately. I closed the laptop instead. A few days later, I met Mark for coffee. Nothing formal. Just two old colleagues catching up. Halfway through the conversation, I turned the screen toward him. I've been working on something, I said. Just out of curiosity. Mark leaned in. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. He didn't say a word. Finally, he sat back slowly and looked at me, not the way people look at someone they're humoring, but the way they look at someone who surprised them. Frank, he said carefully, do you realize what you've built? I shrugged. A solution to an old problem. He shook his head. No, he said. This is bigger than that. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider. The part of me my family had quietly dismissed, the part they thought was outdated, was very much alive. What I didn't know yet was how quickly this quiet idea was about to step out of the garage and into the rest of my life and into theirs. Have you ever noticed how quickly people start listening? Once someone else tells them you're worth hearing? That shift began with a single phone call. A week after I showed Mark what I'd been working on, he called early one morning. Not casual. Not chatty focused. Double quotes, Frank, he said. I showed this to a few people. I sat down slowly. What people? The kind who don't get impressed easily. That was the first time I felt something tighten in my chest. Not excitement, but awareness. The kind that tells you a door has opened, and you didn't plan for it. Mark explained that he'd shared my prototype with a small group of industry contacts. No names yet. Just people who understood construction systems and knew exactly where the real problems lived. They didn't ask how old you were, he said. They asked how soon they could see more. We met 2 days later in a quiet office downtown. Nothing flashy. Glass walls. Neutral furniture. People who listened without interrupting. They asked questions that mattered. Scalability, risk, implementation. Questions I'd been answering in my own head for months. I answered calmly, not defensively. Not eagerly. I wasn't trying to sell myself. I was explaining something I understood by the end of the meeting. One of them leaned back and said, we think this could change how projects are managed. Change, not improve. Not optimize. Change. They didn't talk about funding first. They talked about acquisition. About integrating the platform into existing systems. About building a team around it with me at the center. When the number finally came up, it didn't feel unreal because it was large. It felt unreal because only weeks earlier, I'd been invisible. 7 figures for the initial deal. More tied to performance. I nodded. Asked questions. Took notes. I didn't tell Helen. I didn't tell Daniel or Claire, not because I was hiding, but because I didn't want their reaction. To shape the meaning of the moment, I needed to understand it myself. First, as Christmas approached, Helen packed for the lodge. She moved through the house carefully, the way people do when they're sharing space without connection. The kids called to coordinate plans. No one mentioned me, and something surprised me. I wasn't angry, I felt. Settled, Christmas Eve passed quietly. I ate dinner alone. Watched the snow drift past the window. Spent time in the garage, refining small details. Lawyers were involved now. Timelines were set. The announcement would go public early on Boxing Day. I didn't think much about it. At 12 minutes past midnight, my phone rang. Daniel, his voice sounded different, breathless. Unsteady, Dad, he said. What did you do? I frowned. What do you mean? You're on the news, he said. Your name. It says you sold some kind of technology platform. I sat down. He kept talking, words tumbling over each other. It says millions, Dad. Millions. Is this real? I closed my eyes. Yes, I said quietly. It's real, double quotes. Silence, then my phone began vibrating nonstop. Claire, Helen, numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails stacked faster than I could listen. Just hours earlier, I'd been someone they were comfortable leaving behind. Now, I was suddenly worth calling, and as I stared at the glowing screen in my hand, one thought cut through everything else. Were they reaching out because they finally saw me? Or because they'd just realized what they almost lost? By morning, my phone felt heavier than it ever had. 40-3 messages, 12 missed calls. Emails from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some were congratulatory, some confused. A few from journalists asking for interviews, but most of them, almost all, were from my family. Helen came home early that afternoon. She didn't text. She didn't call. She just walked through the front door the way she used to, before everything became careful. She stood there for a moment, coat still on, looking at me like she was trying to recognize someone she'd misplaced. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It was shaken. I didn't answer right away. Not to punish her, not to make a point. I was honestly deciding how much truth the moment could hold. "Tell you what?" I asked. She stepped closer. The technology, the meetings, the deal. All of it. I looked at her, then really looked. The familiar face. The woman I'd shared decades with. The woman who had asked me, just days earlier, to stay behind. "Would you have listened?" I asked quietly. She opened her mouth, then stopped. That pause told me everything. She sat down slowly. Her legs gave out before her pride did. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought you were just passing time." "That's exactly it," I replied. "You thought." The kids arrived later that evening, separately but close enough together that it felt coordinated. Daniel paced the living room, hands in his pockets. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, eyes fixed on the floor. "Dad," Daniel began. "We had no idea." "I believe you," I said. "That's the problem." They looked up. For a long time, I continued. No one asked what I was working on. No one asked what I was thinking. My opinions weren't challenged. They were dismissed. Daniel winced. "We didn't mean I know," I said. "We just decided who I was, without checking if I was still becoming." Silence settled in. Claire spoke next. "What you built. It's impressive. Everyone's talking about it." I shook my head. "This isn't about being impressive." They waited. "I didn't need recognition," I said. "I needed respect." Long before money ever entered the conversation that landed, Helen wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't realize how invisible you'd become." "That's the thing," I replied. "You don't notice invisibility until the person stops showing up." Daniel swallowed. "What happens now?" It was the first honest question anyone had asked me all day. "I don't know yet," I said. "I just know I won't return to being managed, or minimized, or treated like my best years are behind me." They nodded, quiet, processing. "I'm not closing the door," I added. "Hey. But I'm not pretending everything is fine either." When they left that night, the house grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was clear for the first time in a long while. I wasn't reacting to anyone else's expectations. I was deciding what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. And that decision mattered more to me than any headline ever could, because now that everyone was finally listening, I had to decide who deserved to hear me next. The days that followed felt strangely unsettled. Not chaotic. Not dramatic, just uncertain. That was new for all of us. Helen moved through the house differently now. She asked before making plans. She paused before speaking, as if relearning where I stood. Daniel and Claire checked in more often, their voices careful, almost rehearsed. It would have been easy to enjoy it. The attention, the sudden consideration, the way my words no longer passed unnoticed, but something about it unsettled me. Because respect that arrives late, carries questions with it. One afternoon, Daniel came by alone. No warning. No build-up. He stood in the doorway of the garage, the same space he once joked about tanned, looked around quietly. I didn't know you were this serious, he said. I wiped my hands on a cloth. You didn't ask.
I know.
I should have. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the work that had filled my silence for months. Is this why you didn't say anything? He asked. Because you thought we wouldn't care? I didn't think, I said. I learned. That landed. He winced but didn't argue. Later that week, Helen suggested therapy. Not as a fix but as a place to speak without interruption. We sat across from a calm woman in a softly lit office, 41 years of marriage compressed into an hour. When did you start feeling unseen? The therapist asked me. I took a moment. Not all at once, I said finally. It was gradual. Conversations shortened. My opinions were met with silence. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being someone you checked in with. Helen's eyes filled. I thought you were content, she said. I thought you'd slowed down. I hadn't, I replied gently. You just stopped looking. The truth sat between us. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt. This wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries. Claire approached things differently. She asked questions, real ones. About the work. About how I'd learned new skills. About what still excited me. And she listened. Not because it was impressive, but because it mattered to me. That's when something became clear. I didn't want to be valued because of success. I wanted to be valued without conditions. The deal moved forward quickly after that. Meetings, calls, plans. I stayed involved, but I didn't let it dominate every conversation. I was careful. Because I didn't want my worth to shrink the moment the excitement faded. One evening, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the living room and asked myself a question I'd avoided until then. If none of this had happened, if the platform had failed, there had been no headlines, would they still be trying this hard? The answer mattered, because rebuilding something broken doesn't begin with forgiveness. It begins with honesty. And honesty meant admitting this to myself. Wasn't willing to trade my voice for comfort anymore. Not at my age. Not after everything I'd lived. Not after remembering what it felt like to be fully engaged. Again, whatever came next, reconciliation. Or distance, it had to be real, because respect that depends on success disappears the moment success does. And I wasn't invisible anymore, not because I'd proven something, but because I refused to disappear again. The next step would decide whether this family could grow with me, or whether I would have to keep walking forward on my own. The truth settled slowly, not all at once. After the calls stopped and the apologies softened, after therapy sessions and careful conversations, something unexpected happened. Life grew quieter. Not the uncomfortable silence from before, but a steadier kind of quiet. The kind that lets you hear your own thoughts again. I continued working with the team that acquired the platform. They gave me a small office downtown. Nothing impressive. Just a space where ideas mattered more than titles. For the first time since retirement, I felt useful without obligation. I was building again. But this time, I wasn't building to prove anything. At home, things changed slowly, unevenly. Honestly, Helen and I didn't pretend the last few years hadn't happened. We talked about them, about how easy it is to mistake silence for peace, about how familiarity can quietly turn into dismissal if you stop paying attention. Some conversations were heavy. Others ended without answers, but they were real. Daniel stopped interrupting. He started listening, not just to my advice, but to my reasoning. We disagreed often, but the difference was simple. Now, disagreement didn't mean dismissal. Claire surprised me the most. She didn't come with guilt. She came with curiosity. She asked about learning later in life, about staying patient when no one seemed interested. I think we forget our parents are still growing, she said once. I smiled. We forget ourselves, too. We didn't rush back into old traditions. There was no dramatic return to the lodge that year. No symbolic gesture meant to erase the past. Instead, we built something quieter. Coffee together. Longer conversations. Pauses where no one felt the need to fill the space. And in those pauses, I learned something important. Being seen isn't about attention, it's about presence. One evening, months later, I sat alone in the garage, again the same place where everything had quietly begun. I opened a notebook and sketched a new idea, not because anyone asked me to. Not because I needed it to matter to anyone else, because it mattered to me, and that's when it finally became clear. The real shift didn't come from success, or money, or recognition. It came the moment I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. I didn't need to be louder. I didn't need to be sharper. I didn't need to disappear. I just needed to stay. At my age, people assume growth slows down. They're wrong. Growth doesn't stop. It becomes more intentional. I don't know how many years I have left. None of us do. But I know this. I won't spend them being quietly edited out of my own life. Not again. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, something I wish someone had told me earlier, it's this. You don't become invisible because you stop mattering. You become invisible when you stop insisting on your place. So if you find yourself being spoken over, if your thoughts are dismissed as outdated, if your presence feels negotiable, don't assume it's too late. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do at any age is refuse to vanish and keep building anyway.